Deputy Maureen O'Sullivan and the Deputy is 20 minutes.
Gormagad, Tá ceithre bliain déanta go istigh an seo mar cheachta dál in absplach dál ceantar lárna carrach blad bailíortí. Agus ceapan gur bé cean den fibanna is mó a bhíonna gom gach lá nó fibanna ag buint le cursaí tíochta. And I would say that every single day the office gets numerous calls when it comes to housing matters. Problems relating to housing of one sort or another. I would love to see a really strenuous and a comprehensive campaign and programme to take on all the aspects of housing, whether it's local authority, private rented, whether it's the ghost estates, the role of NAMA, the housing associations, and then an ancillary problem that we have that is really, really bad in Dublin Central is the issue of waste management and illegal dumping. And it's becoming almost like a plague in certain parts of the inner city. And it's something that just, it keeps being pushed between the local authority and the department. And there isn't a very strong programme to deal with that particular aspect as well. So I look at this particular bill and looking at the new rent system and harmonisation of rents with the local authority and the housing assistance scheme. And I know it's going to see responsibility for long-term rent supplement recipients going from the Department of Social Protection to the local authorities. And I think one thing that's very positive about the bill is that it is going to look at the financial circumstances of households, which will be taken into account. And we do know that in these very changing economic climate that we're in today, that household circumstances do change. So a rent that was appropriate at one particular time in a particular circumstance will not be appropriate at another time. And the dependent issue is another one that comes up constantly. How many people are on the floor, how many people are off the floor, and I do think we need a very efficient system to deal with that. I deal with DCC offices in Sean McDermott Street, in Parnell Street, in Cabra and in the civic offices, and I do want to acknowledge their cooperation and the hard work of the staff when myself and the people in my office are in touch with them on the variety of issues that come up when dealing with housing. One point I'd like to make in terms of estate management, it is a feature with the local authorities and they do have a method and a way to deal with issues that arise. And of course a lot of it has to do with antisocial behaviour, with violence and with drugs. But at least when it's local authority housing, there is a mechanism with which to deal with this, and the tenants and the local authority can be brought in and there can be a mediation process which will deal with this, because we do know that there are certain tenants in local authority areas and they do cause absolute havoc for the other residents who are living there, and they are making life totally unbearable for those who want to live their lives in a very peaceable way. There are a number of buts that have to be addressed when it comes to the local authority housing, and the first one that I want to just mention here is the shortages. There is a major shortage of public housing in Dublin Central. There's over 2,300 households on the north inner city, that's only one part of it, housing list, and over 800 of those have been on that list for over 5 years. At the same time, there is at least 120 vacant council housing units in the area, but DCC doesn't have an adequate budget to bring them into use. And it's really very sad, it's very disappointing when you're going around the constituency in different complexes, in different housing estates, and you see these voids boarded up, perfectly good houses, perfectly good flats, with some work could be turned around quickly, but the turnaround period is getting longer. There are places that are waiting over 3 years in order to be turned around, and we look at the housing list at the same time. So it does come down to a funding issue. The Council, Dublin City Council, is dependent on an additional budget from the Department of the Environment to hire contractors to carry out this work. So, as a result of that shortage of public housing, people on the housing list are being directed more and more into the private rented sector. More than half of the households in the North Inner City part are in private rented accommodation, and that seems to be government policy now, because the Department of the Environment Housing Policy Statement in June 2011 sees an even greater role for voluntary and private housing sectors in meeting the housing needs in the future. So that's going to mean an increasing reliance on the private housing market at a time when supply in that area is under fierce pressure in the city. And we know that the pressure on the private rental market in Dublin is leading to higher than expected rent increases. Now, I was just reading this morning the report from Threshold and their latest figures. And the latest index figures an average monthly rental figure of €785 overall on a mid-adjusted basis, but the rents in Dublin are averaging €974. So the national rents have increased by 2% compared with the first quarter of 2012. We know that there are large numbers of landlords who are not registered with the PRTB, and of course that means their tenants are more likely to take up top-up payments, which masks the real rent levels also. But the bottom line is that the rents are too high. So the PRTB index is showing that the strategy by the Department of Social Protection to bring down the rents by reducing the rent supplement, it hasn't worked because the rents are staying stubbornly high. Now, I actually agreed with the Minister bringing down the rent supplement in the sense that I thought it was going to see those rents coming down because people are paying far, far too much for what the accommodation that they are getting. But it hasn't worked, so that has to be looked at again, I believe. And of course, what I'm seeing also is I'm seeing tenants trying to negotiate with some of these landlords themselves on rent issues and other issues, and they're really at a strong disadvantage. So again, I have been trying for 2 weeks to get a topical issue on a very alarming report that came out from Dublin City Council on housing, obviously without success, so I'm going to talk about it today just for a couple of minutes. And it was part of funding from the Department of the Environment to Dublin City Council for an intensified inspection system scheme. And they went into a certain number, over 1,500 I think it was, private rented accommodation in mainly two particular areas in the north inner city that are notorious for very poor landlords. And what they found was over 90% of flats don't meet the basic standards. So 90% of people in certain areas are living in accommodation that's completely unsuitable. So some of the problems in the 1,400 out of the 1,500 flats were deficiencies like unsafe electrics, no private bathrooms, rooms without windows, damp, mould and inadequate heating. So what's happening in those particular parts of the inner city is we're going back to the tenement situations that Sean O'Casey wrote about in the Dublin plays, The Plough and the Stars and Juno and the Paycock. We're back to slum conditions there, and I see it in the constituency. Something else that's happening, I know, is that tenants will rent maybe 1 room or 2 room, and then they will sublet again. So sometimes there's no adequate figures on exactly how many people are living in some of these tenements. Now, landlords were served with over 1,500 notices to improve their flats. Fair enough. And there will be this new system of inspection is going to be working. They're going to choose an area and then keep moving on. But this is the thing that's really alarming. Under the inspection programme, the property cannot be relet until it's brought up to standard, but existing tenants can remain in situ. So that those tenants, 90%, and this substandard accommodation, are forced to continue living in those situations. And what it's going to take will be one of those minimum unsafe electric standards, one of those to go on fire, and we're going to have a situation like what we're reading about in those factories in Bangladesh. So it is an appalling situation. I welcome the money that was granted, but there's no point finding out that something is wrong unless the system is there to do something about it. And that's where the issue is here. And I would have another question about some of these landlords, and that is, are they tax compliant? And again, I don't think we know some of that because so many of them are not registered with the PRTB. There's also, the report said that 75% of those landlords in Dublin who split the houses into flats did so illegally. So as well as maybe tenants subletting, there's also the landlords who have gone down that road as well. There's just another couple of other points that I'd like to make on this. Again, with the private rented, there will be tenants who will go in, and I know this, that they are causing untold problems for the communities where they're living. And every community forum meeting I go to, we hear about these problems, the antisocial behaviour, the violence, the dumping, the total and utter disregard for the communities where they are. Now, unlike the local authority housing, there is no redress system. And I know I think with one community, we spent over a year, but eventually the local authority, with the Gardaí, with the community, eventually got the landlord to do something. But that was over a year, and people living on either side of this particularly unruly rented accommodation, their lives were just misery, and again it involved them with kind of their own mental health problems, their own peace of mind was completely shattered. So there is a real need for this, and I don't know that the PRTB can take on all of this. But again, it comes back to increasing demands on the private rented because the local authority does not have enough housing. One other point on the social housing that is being built, and again I see this in parts of the inner city. Lovely apartment complexes, they're beautiful inside, but there are no play spaces, no open spaces for children. And some of these are in apartment blocks where there are, I suppose, single people coming in or couples coming in who have no families, so they're not particularly interested in the play area and they don't want to hear children out banging, kicking footballs around. But I think it is an area that it is causing problems where there aren't these, adequate play spaces for children who are living in apartments. And we are talking about having more exercise and children getting out into the fresh air, but if they're living in some of these apartment complexes, there's no safe area for them to play that is near them. There's also no doubt that there are problems with homelessness. And of course, again, this is happening at a time when budgets are being decreased. And once again, it's the inner city and parts of Dublin Central that have quite a number of accommodations for homeless people, which is valuable. But again, homelessness is not confined to Dublin City. It affects other areas and people who are there coming from other areas as well. So I do think there is a need that there has to be a spread on these facilities. They're very, very welcome. There is a need for more, but we do have to look at where these services are going. The housing associations are doing, great work. We know that. But again, I would like to see, the regulation so that if there are problems with tenants, that there is a mechanism to address these. And then, of course, NAMA. 2012, 484 NAMA properties in the DCC area were identified as having the potential for social housing. But this, again, it's another process that is proving incredibly slow and very cumbersome and very awkward to deal with. So again, we have people who have housing needs. The housing is there in some cases, but the dots are not being joined up as we're speaking. It's a huge issue, I know that, but I think there's a need. There's so many pieces of this jigsaw, but they're not coming together. And I think there is a need, as I started off by saying, for a very comprehensive programme looking at housing just generally. So thank you.
Thanks, Deputy Minister.